this new project is to get rid of the idea of prehistory and instead to think about history itself as something that stretches back thousands of years before Columbus's arrival. So there's less of a divide between history and prehistory, between Indian time and European time, and to look at the past in a more holistic kind of way. So that's what I'm going to start to do today during the presentation. So I'm happy to answer your questions and hear your feedback because, as I said, this is a new project, so just let me know, what interests you, what surprises you, what you want to hear more about. So I got interested actually in doing Native studies, and I am a specialist in Native American history. I got interested in this story because of the place that I grew up, which is Macon, Georgia. It's an exciting metropolis. It is. This isn't working that well, but so Macon's right in the middle of the state of Georgia, and like Evansville, it's the site of a very important Mississippian city. It's called Ocmulgee. So we have the Ocmulgee Mounds site in Macon, and Macon really for much of the 19th century, the reason why Macon was important was because it was a railroad depot. And that's why I'm showing it on this map here. So you can see that it's an important line, an important stop. It was a cotton depot, really, and that's how it developed in the antebellum and postbellum era. But of course, Macon has a much older history, and so it's this more ancient history that I want to talk about. So this is the Ocmulgee National Monument. It's one of the largest Mississippian sites in North America. It was founded about 950, AD 950, and there are 9 mounds there, the largest of which is about 50 feet tall, but it's actually on top of a natural plateau. So if you view it from the floodplain below, which is where it's really intended to be viewed from, it looks about 100 feet tall. So it's a very impressive kind of site, and it actually literally sits above and on top of the city of Macon, so you can see the city from the top of the biggest mound. And so as a child, I went to summer camp there. We would go on Girl Scout trips there, and actually I was reminded of Ocmulgee recently because of the Winter Olympics. And when I was in high school, the Summer Olympics were in Atlanta in 1996. And so the torch relay was run through Macon. And it was specifically run, where I saw the torch was in Ocmulgee National Monument, and the guy who was running with the torch was one of our local celebrities, Chip Minton, who was a WCW star, professional wrestler, and there he is in his skivvies. And he was also on the bobsled team. He had been an Olympic bobsledder, which is why he was running with the torch. But anyway, I thought that was kind of a funny aside, so you can just imagine him kind of jogging throughout the mounds. So anyway, Ocmulgee, in the sense, there's a way in which Maconites, people from Macon, recognized it as an important part of their history, but it wasn't really integrated into the Georgia history that we learned in school, right? It seemed totally disconnected from that history. So in school, I learned about one history. In summer camp, I saw this other side of history. And of course, the Georgia history that I learned in school, like most colonial histories, had to do with a guy in a fancy wig. So this is James Edward Oglethorpe, who's known as the founder of Georgia, right? He founded Savannah in 1733. And in kind of the popular imagination and what we learned in school, here you can see Savannah as it's laid out. It's a beautiful planned city. This was where Georgia history started, and Native people didn't have much of a role in that history that we learned. And so essentially what interests me as a historian, even when I was a little kid, I was interested in this question, and it still motivates me today, is how do we connect this more ancient history that we obviously see all around us? It's in our place names, it's in the physical environment, it's in the form of these monuments that we see. How do we connect that to the history that's more well known? So this is what I'm still trying to do as a historian, to connect these two stories. And part of the reason why we don't think of those two stories as being integrated is because of a disciplinary divide. between anthropology and history. So when the academy began to professionalize in the mid to late 19th century, history developed separately from anthropology. And the famous German philosopher Hegel thought of, quote, history as humanity's escape from the grip of nature. That essentially what made European civilizations different from and better than other civilizations was that they had broken away from the stationary past, right? That they were no longer a part of nature in the same way that African or Native American societies were. They were something better, more dynamic. And so it had to do with the divide between the West and the rest, the world, but it also had to do with methodology. So historians, as they began to professionalize and began to study this past, we became really dependent on documents, right? So societies that generated documents were studied, and those did not were not studied. We're seen as the province of anthropology. I mean, historians and anthropologists are both interested in otherness, but historians are traditionally interested in other times, so change over time, and anthropologists are interested in other cultures, right? So you can see that as a way in which this disciplinary divide created this distance between who should study what and how they should study it. That is beginning to change. And I would argue that history and anthropology, or I should say history and archaeology in particular, are two disciplines that share a lot in common. And I'm an academic, and in the academy today there's a lot of talk about interdisciplinarity, right? And it's a good word. I think administrators like it because they see us as being more productive and more integrated, joining these different departments together. But the reality of it is that every department doesn't, we can't all speak together as well as history and archaeology can. We have something in common that's really at the heart of our discipline, and that's a primary interest in understanding human and social interactions within specific temporal contexts. So both historians and archaeologists are interested in change over time, and they're interested in evidence-based practices rather than theoretically based practices. So I'd argue that we have a lot in common, and we can use these common tools to begin to break down that divide. And people have started to do this, and especially in the 1990s, there were some really significant efforts, I would say from the 90s up until the present, to try to break down those barriers and to study the past in new kinds of ways. So anthropologists have done this, and some of the work that I found really influential is Charles Hudson's work. He actually studied the expedition of Hernando de Soto. So de Soto was one of the first Europeans to trek through the interior of the Southeast from 1539 to 1539 to 1543. So that's right on the divide of what we usually think of as history and prehistory, anthropology and history. And he looked at the De Soto expedition as a way to try to understand the changes that were brought by Europeans, but also what came before. So he used documents, archaeology, to try to put that story together. And then this is a great book too that has come out, I think in 2007. And in this is an edited volume, this Hero, Hawk, and Open Hand, where archaeologists take some of the really fantastic art and artifacts in Eastern North America and start to piece together a story of what happened in the past, how these things were created, and the meanings behind them. And one of the really interesting things about this volume in particular is that these archaeologists paid a lot of attention to native oral tradition. So what do Native Americans themselves say about these artifacts? And Native people have a lot to say, even about these artifacts that can be hundreds of years old, 1,000 years old. And so historians have started to do this too, to break down this divide. Dan Richter is an early Americanist, and people who study the colonial era in particular have started to practice history in a new way. So the colonial history that I learned in school, right, if I think back to Oglethorpe, and that you guys probably learned in school, it's a celebratory narrative that focuses on Europeans and especially Anglo-Americans to tell this progressive story about the American past that leads to the United States, right? So there's a focus on Anglo people and Anglo actors. And what historians like Richter have done in recent years is to try to tell a story that takes into consideration the actions of Native Americans, of African Americans, of the French, the Spanish, even the Russians, all these different colonial projects that came together in North America. And what Richter did in this specific book, Before the Revolution, is that he started his story in the medieval past, about 1000 AD, and he looked at both North America and Europe to see what was going on in these different places and the forces that brought these people together. And there have been folks who have done things even more ambitiously. There's a new movement called deep history. And people who practice deep history argue that we should go even beyond archaeology to look at early hominid evolution, so early man, that we should go back to our earliest hominid ancestors to try to tell a story that's not just thousands of years old, but millions of years old. That we can use evolutionary biology, genetic mapping, environmental studies to try to think about questions that go back millions of years. So what I'm doing seems pretty modest in comparison to that. So what all this points to is that if we get rid of the category of prehistory and we start to look at a broader base of evidence in a different kind of way, we can tell a more seamless story about America's past that is not just focused on European actors, that focuses on Native people too over a story of thousands of years. So I'm just going to talk a little bit more about what are these methods? What are these methods that we can use to tell this story? And of course, one of the most important methods is archaeology. And so here I've included a few pictures from, this is here, the Angel site. This is IU's field school from 2 summers ago. So you can see the students who are working here in the field, and they're bagging artifacts here, processing the data that they've collected, right? So material culture can tell us a lot about the past, and I'm sure just looking around the museum here, you guys can understand the kinds of information that can be gleaned from the study of material culture. Another kind of methodology that we can think about is environmental studies. And these are things like geophysical data and palynology, which is the study of pollen. Pollen can tell us a lot about when things were built and how long they took to be built. And one thing that I don't want us to get caught in when we think about environmental studies is that we don't want to think that the environment determines human behavior, because it doesn't, right? I think that if we thought about it that way, we would get caught in that trap of thinking about Indians as people of nature, people whose their behavior is totally determined by nature. That's not true. But Dan Flores has a really good explanation of some of the things that environmental studies can bring out for us. And one of these is the theory of possibilism. So what he says is that bioregional environments don't determine human lifeways, but instead offer us a range of possibilities that we can choose from based on our cultural preferences. And the other part of that is that humans change their environments, and so populations that come after inherit those changes, right? So humans themselves shape the environment, they shape it for future generations who inherit those consequences. And certainly we're living with that today. And I've included here this is a really beautiful, what it actually is an engraving based on a painting that was done with the Roanoke colony in the 1580s. So the Roanoke colony is the earliest attempt to colonize Virginia, but it's actually where North Carolina is today, so it's kind of coastal North Carolina. This is a native village called Secotoin. It's hand-colored, which I think kind of brings back the village to life. But you can see how native people themselves, even the first time that the English come into this environment, they've altered the environment, right? They have a planned community. It's very orderly. They have their fields. Here's their fallow fields. And here their newly planted corn. So native people themselves, even before Europeans show up, they're burning forests to clear way for both hunting land and planting land. They're farmers. Most native people are farmers in 1491. And so Europeans inherit those fields and pastures as colonialism moves on. So anyway, these environmental studies are another way that we can understand how humans shaped environments. One methodology that I've already mentioned, one kind of source, is oral tradition. So native peoples, even if in the absence of a written language, oral tradition itself can be a kind of history. And just as an example of how powerful this source can be, I'm using the example of the Berger figurine. Has anybody ever seen this? So it was recovered near Cahokia. It was made around AD 1050 to 1150, which is the height of Cahokia. And Cahokia, for those of you who haven't been there, it's the Mounds site that is just east of St. Louis, on the other side of St. Louis, and it was the largest Native American site north of Mexico in the pre-Columbian period. But anyway, one thing that this Berger figurine shows, this is, as you can tell, especially more in profile, this is a woman who is, she's leaned over something, and can you guys tell what she's doing there? She's hoeing. She's hoeing, so this is a stone hoe. And this would have been the kind of hoes that native farmers used before the colonial trade brought about steel. Or I should say iron. But in any case, can you tell what she's hoeing here? Can you tell what she's on top of? I mean, you think she's it would probably, yes.
Is it a mound of earth?
You would think it would be a mound of earth, right? But it's actually a snake. So this is the front of the figurine. Maybe I should have explained that. And this is her inside profile, and this is the back. And so you can see the face of the snake here. And can you tell what is on her back? Maybe for those of you who are closer to the front, can you see what those are? Does that look like a baby though?
I thought it did.
Gourds. It's gourds.
Oh, okay.
You would think it would be a baby, right? And I think that the artist is kind of playing with that idea. But these are gourds that it's actually a vine that's connected from the snake's body up her back. And so maybe, you look at it on its face and it's kind of a puzzling figure, but partially what archaeologists and anthropologists did was they consulted oral traditions, and there are a couple from the Shawnees and the Pawnees that were particularly helpful in deciphering what does this figure mean. And in those oral traditions, this seems to refer to a woman who they call our grandmother, or the woman who never dies. And what she seems to be hoeing is the back of this water panther. So the water panther is this kind of mythic creature who lives in the underworld, who is connected to disorder, but also fertility. So he has this kind of fertile power. And essentially what's happening, another thing that we know from Native American art is that people, if they're depicted in statuary with their mouths open, that usually means that they are dead, or some kind of a mythic, legendary figure. So in other words, not an ordinary person or a dead person, that they have some kind of special status. They pass into the afterlife, or they themselves are a figure of the afterlife. So anyway, if we kind of put what we know from the oral tradition in context with the figure itself, what this is doing is it's connecting the fertility of women's bodies to the productive power of the earth. If you go around the museum here, and if you're a fan of archaeology and you go to other archaeological sites, one thing that you'll see is that Native Americans farming is very much a women's profession in Native societies, right? It's very much connected to femininity, to women's jobs. And this is one kind of evidence that we can point to say, well, this has been the case for a long time, that Native Americans connect women's bodies with the productive power of the earth, and perhaps even the underworld, the panther deity, water panther deity. So oral tradition, that's another kind of methodology that we can use that remains relevant today. So one more method, and of course I'm a historian, so a lot of what I work with are documents. And what you have on the left here is a European text. It is actually one of the original texts from the Hernando de Soto expedition. So that de Soto expedition, the first one that goes extensively throughout the Southeast, it had 4 different chroniclers. And so this is one of the accounts. And it's one of the ways that we can start to see Native people through the eyes of Europeans, but they can also give us signals about what happened in the past in these Native societies. And one thing that I want to suggest too is that Native people have their own way of keeping history. That history itself is not just a Western practice, that it's a practice that other people share. And just a few examples of this, if people, archaeologists who work in the plains, are lucky enough to have winter counts. So this is a bison robe that depicts what would happen in these kinds of situations, is that an elder who was usually a medicine person, and that occupation often went along with being a tribal historian, that person would record whatever was the most important event in a given year. And that would be that symbol for the winter. So for example, if you look at some of these, you might see a bow and arrow here. Here's a sick person. So those would be times when we warred, times when we had smallpox. And if you got a really knowledgeable medicine person, they can use these winter counts and go back dozens of years, 100 years, right? So these are things that they learn from their elders and that they keep on in their memory. And what it really is a kind of mnemonic device, meaning a memory device. And so it aids those oral traditions. It's a kind of documentary record that helps to reinforce those oral traditions and help people to remember. And this is a similar kind of idea that actually comes out of the Southwest from the Tohono O'odham. And this is a calendar stick. So in the O'odham tradition, they would make these kind of marks, also signaling every year. And again, if you're a kind of learned elder, you could use those marks to take back your history and tell about the important things that happened to your people. So some of the folks who practice deep history, they think of history really broadly. The documents are residual evidence from an earlier time, not just written documents, but stone tools, skeletal remains, and burned seeds plucked from ancient hearths. So they're arguing that as historians, we need to think much more broadly about what constitutes evidence. Okay, so what if we take these broader, kinds of evidence and these different methodologies and try to tell a different kind of story about America's past, or American history in general. A history that doesn't begin with Jamestown in 1706 or with the United States in 1776, a history that makes those events look like yesterday's news. A different kind of narrative. So this is one of the ideas that I'm playing around with. That you could tell a story about the settlement of North America with the first peoples, and you could look at what Native people are doing on the land. So they're trading. We know that there are trade networks that go back across the continent. It's since the Archaic period, so thousands of years ago. We can also think about Native Americans as pilgrims, and not just like funny hats and buckle shoes pilgrims, but in the sense of religious worshipers who go to a special kind of sacred site to practice. They're farmers. As I said, in 1491, most Native people are farmers. They're also city dwellers, and we can see that, partially with sites like Angel, but also Cahokia or Ocmulgee, which I'll get back to. Something that starts to happen is that Native people are also nation builders, that especially in the wake of diseases and violence that are introduced by European colonialism, that Native people don't just die off, right? That they're still here, and they create different kinds of political formations to deal with the problems of colonialism. Okay, so if we take these new ideas, I want to see how we can put this into practice if we looked at the history of Ocmulgee. So going back to Ocmulgee. So, like I said, Ocmulgee itself dates from about AD 900 or AD 950. And of course, Native people had been living in that region for thousands of years. There actually have been Clovis points that were found on the same site, which those go back to about 9,000 BC. So indigenous people had been living in the area for a long time, but this specific native city is built 900 to 950. And we have every reason to believe that it was built by the ancestors of the Creek or Muskogee Indians. And in Muskogee, the place name, Ocmulgee, means place of the bubbling spring, or if you want to be less poetic about it, the boiling water. And that probably refers to the fact that Ocmulgee is right on the fall line of Georgia, so it's where the geography kind of transitions from the Piedmont into the coastal plain. So there is actually an elevation drop, which creates a falls there. So in the Creek migration story, we go back to oral tradition. They say that they came from the west, from a dangerous place that had death and disease, and that they overcame many trials and tribulations to migrate eastward. And when they got east to the place where they wanted to settle, Ocmulgee was their first town in this new place. This is how Creeks remember the story. And Ocmulgee itself is a planned town. So we kind of actually saw that before with Secotoan. It's a planned town. It's organized, or it is planned along to be oriented toward the cardinal directions. There are 9 mounds on the site, and they're well spaced. There are actually more space in between them than at a lot of Mississippian sites. And they had public areas in between these mounds. Even as new buildings were added to the site, this site plan was maintained. Now, there are not that many residential structures at the Ocmulgee site. It's mostly these bigger ceremonial structures that, if we look in other kinds of contexts, those would be consistent with chiefs' houses or other kinds of big public spaces. So it's possible that Ocmulgee is less of a residential city and more of a trading center and probably a ceremonial center too. So we see that image of Native Americans as traders and pilgrims coming into play. And some of the kind of iconic art that you guys may be familiar with, that's often associated with the, quote, Southeastern cult. You get that at Ocmulgee. So you get shell beads coming from the Gulf Coast. You get pottery in the shape of humans, really elegant kinds of pottery. So they're also connected to the broader region through this kind of trade. And it's definitely a site of governance. It's a chiefly capital. One thing that's distinctive about Ocmulgee that's a little strange in terms of other Mississippian sites is that there's an earth lodge there. And there's actually a couple of other earth lodges that have been that were discovered at the same site, and one that was very nearby, within a mile or two. And people, the way that it has been reconstructed and the way that it's interpreted at the park today, it looks a little bit plain style. You know, it's actually covered. It looks like a Mandan earth lodge, if you've ever seen a picture of one of those. And some archaeologists have critiqued that and said that it was probably more of an earth embanked building with maybe a thatch roof. But in any case, the floor itself is original. So here's the original floor. And you can see at the bottom picture here, there's a head, which is probably sort of a large bird. And Georgians like to think that it's an eagle, right? Probably because Americans like eagles. And, but it looks more like a buzzard, to be honest with you guys. But it just doesn't have the same reign of majesty, I think, for Americans. And here's the central fire pit in the middle. But it's an interesting kind of spot. And what partially what's so interesting about this is that that the inside of the earth lodge is ringed by these seats. And so at the top kind of level, the highest elevation, you have the buzzard head. And then radiating outward from him, you have seats that are at a lower level. So, you know, the way that we could interpret this in terms of a political structure is that maybe the chief is in the middle here, and people of lesser political or military rank are sitting, you know, literally elevated below him, right? But it's an interesting space, and I'll come back to this in a minute. It's one of those things that makes Ocmulgee a little bit distinctive. So how are all these people supported at Ocmulgee? Well, we know they're farmers, and actually it's very clear that farming was going on a massive scale at Ocmulgee, partially because there's been a field discovered underneath Mound D. So you can actually see that pretty well in this picture from the 1930s. And this is from, much of the site was excavated with the WPA in the 1930s. And who's doing the farming? Probably women, right? If we think back to the Berger figure. So Ocmulgee itself, you know, it has its heyday for a couple hundred years. And then people leave the mounds. They stay in the area, but they're not really living in that mound site anymore. They're living nearby. And one of the reasons that we know that is because when DeSoto comes through he comes through this area in 1540, so several hundred years later, and he comes to a chief's capital that's about 3 kilometers away from that original Ocmulgee site, so it's really, really close. And by that time, this other village, which is the new regional capital, is called Echeezy, which means place of the rat in Muskogee. And so when the chief comes out to greet DeSoto, he asks him 3 questions, which are very commonsensical, I think. Who are you? What do you want? And where are you going? And Soto replied that he was a captain of the great king of Spain. He had come to bring the holy faith of Christ, and that they should acknowledge Christ and be saved, and that they were now vassals of the emperor, the king of Castile, Charles V. Now this must come as a huge surprise. Now they did have interpreters between Soto and the indigenous people of the area, but even if they did understand any of that, it probably made absolutely no sense. Because of course, Muskogee people continued to dominate this area for hundreds of years after Soto came. The Ocmulgee site itself is reoccupied in the late 1600s. And part of that, the reason why we know that Muskogee people are they are trade partners with South Carolina, and that Ocmulgee is an important stop on the road to Charleston. So you can see this is a kind of This is a diorama inside of the museum now, but it gives you kind of a good idea of here's the trading post in the background, and if we could see the mounds, they would be over here somewhere. But this is Colonel James Moore and his men, and he's raising an army of Muskogee guys to go raid Spanish Florida in this diorama. So at that point, the Muskogees are trade partners of the English. But that relationship sours during the Yamasee War. So the Yamasee War happens from 1715 to 1718, and essentially Native people in the Southeast decided that the British were abusing trade, and particularly the Indian slave trade. So one of the things that happened was that guys like these Muskogees, when they raided enemy settlements, they would sell Indian slaves to the English. But the English got too greedy. They started to enslave people who they shouldn't, people who were actually free. They started to demand outrageous payments for debts, for English trade goods. So this is a rising up against the English. And the Muskogees killed almost all of the English traders who lived in their nation. So as a retaliatory measure, the English destroy this settlement at Ocmulgee. They massacre the inhabitants and burn down this fort that you can see in the background here. And so in the aftermath of that attack, the Creek people who were living there, and here's a map of the whole region. So if we're looking at the Ocmulgee site, it's on the river that bears its name, it's up here. And after this attack, actually Charleston's over here, so you can kind of get a sense of how it's on the way. They go back to their villages along the Flint and Chattahoochee rivers. So they go back to this region. But they still sometimes would go back to Ocmulgee. It's not as though the Creek or Muskogee people totally forgot about the site. In fact, they always remembered the site as their ancient capital. And they would sometimes camp there after they reestablished relations with South Carolina and wanted to go back on the road to Charleston. But this is a really interesting vignette. Let me go back to this one. So when they would camp at this place, they once told an English trader that they remembered it as this awe-inspiring ancient capital, but it's a haunted place too. And probably part of the reason why it's haunted is because of that massacre that happened during the Yamasee War. But what they said was that they always hear, quote, "At the dawn of the morning, the usual noise of Indians singing their joyful religious notes and dancing as if going down to the river to purify themselves, and then returning to the old townhouse." So they thought of it as a place that was haunted by their ancestors, and maybe also haunted by the spirits of the dead whose deaths had been unavenged. So it's a holy place, a sacred place, a haunted place. And eventually it's a place where whites start to trespass more and more. So by the 1790s, these Anglo settlers, who by this time, included those kind of descendants of Oglethorpe and his followers, right, who had moved inward from Savannah, they start to take up Muskogee resources. And this is a speech by two Lower Creek headmen in 1809. They trespass on our rights by placing fish traps in the Ocmulgee, expressly forbidden by a treaty with the government of the United States. They hunt on our land and kill our deer and turkeys, which are our property. They take our cedar and other wood from our land and seem to use the freedom of real owners. Creeks had ceded most of this territory. So Creek ceded most of central Georgia in this treaty that was negotiated in 1806 in Washington, but they actually kept Ocmulgee itself, the site, because they thought of it as being so sacred. But eventually, during the removal era, they're forced to give up the entirety of their eastern claims. So all the land that they had left in Georgia and Alabama. And much like, we hear about the Cherokees and the Trail of Tears, well, the Creeks and all other Eastern people had their own Trail of Tears. So they finally give up this area of central Georgia in the 1830s, and surveyors come out to lay out the city of Macon. One of the surveyors called the people living on the banks of Ocmulgee the most outrageous ruffians, rollicking young women, and naughty children I had ever seen. So that sounds about right to me. But in any case, and you can see part of what's great about this map is that it's showing the major southeastern nations and the routes that they had to take to get to Indian Territory, which is now, much of it is the state of Oklahoma. So the Creeks are going from this region to kind of central, what's now central Oklahoma. And Tulsa is actually originally a Creek town. So that's in the kind of the eastern part of that new Creek nation. But one of the things that I want to think about in this project is that the death of Ocmulgee, I'm sorry, let me start over. So the birth of Macon does not signal the death of Ocmulgee. So it's actually a place that Native peoples have retained. And one of the really interesting things that happens during removal, and you can see that the Creeks themselves, they actually walk most of the way to Indian Territory. So they walk all the way until Little Rock, and then they take steamers to Fort Gibson where they disembark and finish walking the rest of the way to their new land. And as these guys are walking, the medicine people, usually there's one medicine person from each town who's designated to carry the sacred fire. And the sacred fire is this representative of the sun on earth, and it represents the town itself. And so if you can imagine, they're trekking, 400, 500 miles, overland with these torches, these sacred torches, and that they're going to then relight and reignite these fires in their new towns in Indian Territory. And this is what happens with Ocmulgee. Ocmulgee is revived in Indian Territory. It becomes a town. You can see it here. So it's in the eastern part of what's now Oklahoma, in the Creek Nation. And into the 19th century, it remains an important Muskogee political town. It produces Principal Chief Pleasant Porter, who's one of the most famous chiefs in the annals of Creek history. And since 1868, so since the Civil War, it has been the site of the reconstituted Creek national government. And today, this is where the Creek national government resides. So this is their tribal government complex in what they call the Mound building. And as you guys can see, it is meant to resemble that Earth Lodge back in Ocmulgee. So they themselves are continuing on with the tradition of the Mound Builders, a tradition that they see as part of the unbroken past. And we couldn't see that history if we didn't look back so deeply. We couldn't see that Native people are still invoking it today. So let me just wrap up just a couple of points about why we should study deep history. So what do we get out of it? One is that we can understand that America has an ancient history. So I teach history courses at IU, and one of the things I hear a lot is, I went to Europe this summer, and wouldn't it be great if America had an ancient history like Europe did? America does, you just don't know what it is. So what you have in this slide, what I've shown is we have Cahokia on the left, and Cahokia is almost like a mega Ocmulgee, or a mega angel site. It's another planned city, and it's actually the third largest mound in the world. So only the Pyramid of the Sun in Teotihuacan and the Great Pyramid in Chwala are larger. So Khufu's pyramid in Egypt, which is the largest of the three pyramids at Giza, is actually smaller than Cahokia, Monk's Mountain at Cahokia, which is an interesting story. So, we can understand that America has an ancient history, and not just the kind of shallow history that's associated with colonialism. And actually, America, the United States, is a very, very new country, comparatively speaking. It also, if we study deep history, it bridges this great divide, the divide between native time and European time, the divide between archaeology and history, the kind of source-based divide that prevents us from seeing these stories as connected. So on this slide I have, this is a Navajo depiction of Spanish conquistadors. And on the right, this is a letter from the King of Spain, Charles V, to Coronado, authorizing his expedition. And so they're probably actually two documents that relate to the same thing. It also helps us understand that America is home to many nations. So you can see on the left this map of all the different indigenous peoples. And this is kind of rough, but you could say 1491. And then on the right, this is actually an interesting map. It's made in 1783, right after the conclusion of the Revolution. And you can actually see the 13 colonies on the right here. But if you got a close-up of this map, which I really like, you can still see all the Indian nations. So the author of this map also included all the Indian nations mapped onto the same document. And that America today is a place that has multiple sovereignties. So the Native people haven't disappeared. They're not just this changeless people of the past. That if we look at deep history, it's right and it's correct to emphasize the trauma of colonialism, but we shouldn't mistake that trauma for a break with the past. That Native people are still here, and it helps us understand that story of both their deep past and their continued presence. And on the right, this is an interesting map because all these, if you see the actual text of these different place names, these are all the reservations in the United States. But then the orange parts are places with heavy Native population. So they also help show us where a lot of Native people are living. Because actually, today, most Native people are city dwellers. They're urbanites. And then on the right, this is a picture of a group of Mississippi Choctaws who live in this community. And the state of Mississippi has recently given them back Nunawaya, which is their mother mound, where they believe that they emerged. So you can see them continuing these mound-based traditions that place the mounds at the center of their social, political, cultural, religious identity. So I just conclude with this statement by Frederick Jackson Turner, who's not normally known as a champion of Native Americans, but I think that this quote really sums up some of the benefits of deep history. So to history, there are only artificial divisions. The roots of the present lie deep in the past. And I want us to think about the possibility of not just history in a straight line, a kind of linear progressive history, but a layered history. These roots show up today. So I'll just conclude there, and I'll take your questions.